Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a flickering world of shadows and silence, a world where gas lamps sputter, coal fires hiss, and your only company after sundown might be the slow creak of a floorboard or the distant hoot of an owl. You lie there, wide-eyed, watching the ornate wallpaper ripple in the lamplight, heart thudding a little too fast. It's not the dark that scares you, not exactly. It's the stillness, the not sleeping, the long, crawling hours between midnight and dawn, when your thoughts unravel like loose stitching and no one, not your doctor, not your mother, not even your pastor, knows quite what to do with you. Oh, and by the way, you probably won't survive this era's sleep cures. Not if the arsenic doesn't get you, the bed cage might. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts in the early decades of Queen Victoria's reign, when gaslights first hissed their way into homes and cities buzzed with the hum of progress. For the first time, people could choose not to sleep, which sounds kind of glamorous until you realize how often they found themselves unable to sleep. That's where you are now, cocooned in a too quiet bedroom where the walls feel closer every hour. Back then, sleep wasn't a private bodily function. It was a social performance, a reflection of your moral hygiene, your character, your place in society. Good people slept soundly. You, tossing and turning night after night? You were suspect. But it wasn't just moral panic. You see, the Victorians were also terrified of death by darkness. London's streets grew menacing after sunset. Thieves, rats, and worse skittered through alleys. Candles flickered out too quickly. The very air seemed thicker, like it might smother you if you dared to close your eyes. So what did you do when sleep wouldn't come? First, you worried. Then you paced. Then you tried not to panic. Victorians called it night terrors long before we linked that phrase to childhood. For adults, it was more existential, lying flat on your back, staring at a ceiling you could barely see, mind spinning like a penny on marble. That's when you hear it, the ticking. Tiny, innocent, but maddening. Somewhere in your home, a mantel clock grinds its gears, each second a little hammer tapping away your sanity. Some homes had a dozen clocks, each with their own smug tick. The time was always present, always reminding you how long you hadn't slept. One woman wrote that her mantel clock was as cruel as a bell tolling my failure. Dramatic? Sure. But also, relatable. By the 1850s, insomnia had become fashionable in all the worst ways. Charles Dickens, yes, the Charles Dickens, was famously afflicted. He wandered the streets of London late into the night, dodging prostitutes and fog, hoping to exhaust himself into slumber. He even claimed his bed had to face exactly north-south or else he couldn't sleep. Historians still argue whether he suffered from undiagnosed sleep apnea or just had a flair for dramatic pacing. Other notable insomniacs included Florence Nightingale, who believed the sick could only recover in perfectly ventilated sleep chambers, and Lord Byron, who preferred writing erotic poetry in bed at 2 a.m. while nibbling opium-laced chocolate. But you? You're just a middle-class Victorian trying to survive your next night. You've tried warm milk. You've said your prayers. You've counted every crack in the ceiling. Nothing works. And now the gaslight's starting to sputter. You're down to one match. The dread of nightfall was so thick, doctors began issuing warnings: avoid caffeine, cold feet, and certain upsetting novels. Yes, Victorians believed that Gothic sentiment could cause chronic insomnia. Mary Shelley, you're on notice. And yet, despite all their rituals and warnings, the problem kept growing. Especially in the cities. In London alone, apothecaries started reporting record sales of night-soothing elixirs. Spoiler, most were just alcohol or diluted laudanum. Effective? Sometimes. Safe? Not remotely. One dose too strong and you slept, permanently. Still, the obsession with fixing insomnia was as loud as the clocks causing it. Society was frantic for answers, which meant solutions were arriving faster than sense. You could buy dream-inducing candles made of sleep wax. You could hire sleep assistants to hum lullabies from the hallway. You could even purchase pamphlets with instructions like immerse the feet in brine before bed. One fringe theory suggested sleeping underground, in cellars or even repurposed coal bunkers, might reset your nervous system. Historians still argue whether anyone actually tried it or if it was just another health guru's delusion. but the darkness never changed. And each night, you laid back on your too soft horsehair mattress and begged your body to just shut up. Because you knew, morning would come, and with it, judgment. A yawning employee might be labeled slothful. A drowsy wife? Hysterical. An exhausted child? Probably under spiritual attack. So you keep faking it, pretending to sleep so your servants, or your husband, or your mother won't start asking questions. Your bedroom becomes a stage, and every twitch under the coverlet is part of your unscripted act. And still, that ticking. Louder now. Your body, defiant. The night, endless. You've made it to morning, somehow. Pale light oozes through the lace curtains like cold porridge. You're still alive, technically, but you feel embalmed. A headache pulses behind your eyes. Your limbs ache with the indignity of having not rested but merely paused. Now, here's the kicker, your lack of sleep. It's no longer just a personal misfortune. It's a public health concern. At least, that's what Victorian newspapers and doctors want you to believe. By the 1860s, insomnia has burst through boudoirs and boarding houses to become a full-blown crisis. Not just I couldn't sleep last night, but our entire nation is on the verge of collapse because no one is sleeping properly. You hear it in pamphlets, from pulpits, even whispered in sewing circles, sleep loss equals moral decay. Britain's greatness, its industry, its empire, its railways, depends on well-rested minds. And if people like you can't sleep, well, then the whole thing's at risk of toppling. Medical journals begin printing dire headlines, an epidemic of sleeplessness. The night disease. You see illustrations of gaunt-eyed men and women with captions like before chloral hydrate. That's the new chemical on the block, a sleep aid that some physicians hail as a miracle and others quietly note occasionally stops hearts. By now, doctors are divided into two camps, the herbalists, who swear by valerian and hops, and the chemists, who love their new sedatives and don't care if they're addictive. Spoiler, they are. You could walk into a high street apothecary and request a sleep cordial, and the man behind the counter would sell you a blend of ethanol, chloroform, morphine, and sometimes, just to jazz things up, a pinch of arsenic. Side effects? Well, if you count bleeding gums, hallucinations, and the possibility of coughing up parts of your own esophagus, then sure. But you'll sleep, right? Still, if you're respectable, you don't talk openly about taking such things. No, instead you book an appointment with your nerve doctor. These were the precursors to psychiatrists, often more interested in your wallpaper color than your actual brain chemistry. One famous nerve consultant, Dr. Silas Moffat, claimed insomnia was caused by overcooked thoughts, ideas that had been left too long in the mind's stew pot. His solution? Gentle walks, soft poetry, and ice water enemas. Because apparently, the Victorians had never met a problem they didn't try to fix via the colon. Historians still argue whether the medicalization of insomnia helped or harmed sufferers more. On one hand, it gave legitimacy to their struggle. On the other, it opened the door to some profoundly unhelpful treatments. Like the somnambulating chair, a metal-framed recliner suspended on springs that was supposed to rock you unconscious. Or the brain cradle, which cradled only your forehead with a damp sponge while promising to calm the frontal nerves. There were even doctors who believed too much reading caused insomnia. You could be diagnosed with book brain, a terrifying condition in which your neurons were apparently overexcited by fiction. The solution? Burn the novels. And maybe stare at a blank wall for several hours before bed. And then there was the class element. Always the class element. If you were rich, your insomnia was tragic, poetic, and symbolic of your intellectual sophistication. If you were poor, it meant you were lazy or impure or simply working the wrong kind of factory job. Sleep inequality was very real, and it showed up in your mattress quality, your access to doctors, and whether or not your landlady kept a rooster under the floorboards. That's not a joke, by the way. One recorded complaint from a tenant in East London blamed their sleeplessness on a rooster kept below stairs, who crows in response to cold deliveries. Because nothing says restful like poultry-induced paranoia. For women, especially, insomnia became a code word for everything else wrong in their lives. If you were unmarried and couldn't sleep, it was your womb's fault. If you were married and couldn't sleep, it was probably your husband's fault. Either way, you'd be prescribed quiet rest, chamomile poultices, and absolutely no novels. You begin to realize that no one really knows what causes insomnia. But everyone thinks they do. So they diagnose. And they lecture. And they sell. Oh, Do they sell? You can buy anti-insomnia gloves, bed sheets made of eel skin, and neurasthenia bonnets lined with lead mesh to keep your thoughts from floating off in the night. And when none of that works, you blame yourself. Because that's what Victorian society taught you. Sleep is natural, and if you can't do it, you're unnatural. Which is why, as you try to rest tonight, you're already feeling the dread kick in. Not just the fear of being tired, but the fear of what that says about you. Are you weak? Unwell? Undisciplined? It's exhausting, isn't it? To be this tired and still carries so much shame. You lie in bed trying to perform calmness, like maybe if you imitate sleep well enough, the real thing will show up. Meanwhile, your neighbor 3 houses down has just fallen asleep to the sound of a lavender-scented metronome. Your cousin up north swears by wrapping her feet in lamb's wool. And that cousin's husband? He just got fitted for a sleep corset, because nothing says relaxation like spinal compression. You stare at the ceiling and consider chloroform. You consider poetry. You consider checking the clock, but you know it'll only mock you. So you close your eyes, not to sleep, but to hide. Tonight, you're determined to try something new. Not the usual prayers or foot raps or gentle recitations of Psalm 4 verse 8, but something with a bit more bite. You've paid a visit to your local chemist, and now you're holding a small green glass bottle labeled simply, Bedtime Elixir. No ingredients listed, of course. Why ruin the surprise? You pull the cork. The smell hits first, astringent, earthy, with just a hint of licorice and death. You down a tablespoon like the pamphlet says. The burning in your throat says alcohol. The sudden warmth in your gut says maybe a little opium. The wave of dizziness that follows? That could be the arsenic. Or maybe just the exhaustion finally letting go. Welcome to the dangerous world of Victorian sleep tonics, where chemistry and quackery held hands and danced straight into your bloodstream. You're now one of thousands relying on bottled silence, trusting that the same people who sell tooth powders and rat poison also know how to lull the human brain into stillness. And sometimes, they do. You drift for a few hours. Float, even. But when you wake at 2:47 a.m., your mouth feels like it's been carpeted, and your head is buzzing like a distant beehive. Your stomach's staging a mutiny. And you're no closer to real rest than you were last night. Still, tonics were the go-to remedy. Laudanum, essentially alcohol-diluted opium, was as common as aspirin today. Even respectable housewives kept a bottle in the kitchen cupboard, right next to the jam. It was marketed as safe, effective, and even beneficial to the Constitution. Never mind the stories of people forgetting their children's names or having vivid hallucinations of green spiders knitting inside the curtains. Minor side effects, surely. Historians still argue whether laudanum did more to cure or cause the insomnia epidemic. Some patients swore it was the only way they could sleep. Others became so dependent they couldn't sleep without it, and began dosing higher and higher, until the line between rest and death blurred uncomfortably thin. And that was just the beginning. Arsenic, while better known as a poison, was often used in microscopic doses to stimulate drowsiness and improve pallor. You might take it in a wafer or a cordial. If you were lucky, you'd just vomit. If not, well, at least your autopsy would show a lovely complexion. Then there was chloral hydrate, sometimes called knockout drops. First synthesized in 1832, it became popular in the latter half of the century for its fast-acting sedative effects. And unlike laudanum, it didn't make you euphoric, it just knocked you into a deep, cold, dreamless sleep. Doctors praised its power. Patients, less so. One newspaper account described waking from chloral sleep as emerging from the grave, gasping, heart stilled with dread. But not every tonic was chemical warfare. Some were just weird. There was Dr. Billington's sleepy syrup, made from boiled lettuce water, sugar, and essence of stillness. No one quite knew what that meant, but it sounded classy. Others swore by elixirs made with ground pearl, rose petals, or crushed beetles, because if you can't sleep, at least you can indulge in artisanal suffering. The competition was fierce. Makers of sleep tonics knew branding mattered. Bottles were engraved with gold leaf lettering, given names like Nocturne's Embrace or Repose of the Lion. One tonic even claimed to contain moonbeam essence, which was either poetic or deeply concerning. And let's not forget the mail-order sleep cures. You could send away for powdered dream pills, complete with handwritten instructions from some man calling himself a professor of the midnight sciences. These pills often arrived wrapped in wax paper, along with promises like slumber in 10 minutes or your sovereign back. The success of these remedies was always hard to verify. For every testimonial from a satisfied sleeper, there were hushed stories of servants found stiff in their beds, clenching empty tonic bottles in pale fingers. Still, you keep experimenting, because the fear of never sleeping outweighs the fear of the bottle. One night, you try 2 tonics against the chemist's advice. The result? You sleep for 14 hours. You wake up convinced it's Sunday, only to be told it's Wednesday. That's when you start to question the very idea of sleep as natural. If your body resists it so much, maybe it's broken. Maybe you're broken. You read in the newspaper about a woman in Birmingham who hadn't slept in 21 days. They called her a medical marvel. You feel the tremble in your fingers and wonder how far you're headed down that same road. In truth, many of these cures weren't designed for longevity. They were bandages slapped over bullet wounds. Because sleep wasn't just about being tired, it was tangled with class, virtue, and sanity. To be an insomniac was to risk social death. So better to drink the elixir. Better to hope it works tonight. Even children weren't spared. Babies were given Godfrey's cordial, a syrup of opium and treacle, to hush their cries and lull them to sleep. In fact, this stuff was so common that some midwives called it Mother's Little Savior. Hospitals started noticing that children from working-class neighborhoods often showed signs of sedation, not from illness, but from being routinely dosed to keep them quiet. No wonder so many people were foggy, feverish, and slightly dissociated by lunchtime. The Victorian world had turned to chemistry for comfort and gotten something closer to controlled poisoning. Tonight, you cradle your latest bottle, eyeing the label like a gambler eyeing dice. Will it be relief? Or a deeper trap? And still the ticking continues. You swear the clock sounds smug. You're staring at it again. That polished brass menace on the mantel. Tick, tick, tick. A mechanical mockery of your failure to drift. The clock, meant to organize your day, has become the loudest, most judgmental thing in your room. You're not alone in this. In homes across Victorian Britain, people are beginning to suspect that timekeeping itself is the enemy. Once, clocks were marvels of craftsmanship, proud centerpieces of middle-class aspiration. But now, they're traitors. They measure every second your eyes stay open, every minute your thoughts refuse to settle. You lie there in your lace nightgown, sweating beneath a crocheted blanket, and that infernal tick makes your pulse sink to anxiety. It wasn't always like this. In pre-industrial times, sleep was softer, slower. People woke in the middle of the night, chatted, wandered, maybe even nibbled a snack before drifting off again. 2-part sleep, historians now call it. Entirely natural. But by the Victorian era, factory whistles and train timetables demanded something else, continuous sleep. A full, obedient 8 hours. Preferably while lying stiff and silent like a respectable corpse. And who polices that sleep? Why, your friendly household clock, of course. As the 19th century marched forward, clocks multiplied. They sat on shelves, hung on walls, crouched on desks like miniature tyrants. They crept into bedrooms and pointed fingers. If you weren't asleep by 10, you were suspicious. If you weren't awake by 6, you were slothful. And the alarm clock? Oh, don't even get started. Invented with good intentions, the alarm clock was supposed to help people wake for work. But it backfired. It made people watch the clock as they tried to sleep, calculating backward from the dreaded bell. If I fall asleep now, I'll get 6 hours. Now 5. Now 4. Sound familiar? The anxiety loops were real. One insomniac wrote that she could feel the hands dragging themselves across the face as if time itself were a ghost crawling toward her bed. Victorians became obsessed with this silent oppression. Letters to newspapers began to suggest that bedroom clocks were causing nervous disorders. Remove them, one columnist declared. Time, like a snake, ought not to share the bed. And so began the clock purge. Doctors, home guides, and even ministers started recommending the total removal of timepieces from the bedroom. One physician claimed that time anxiety was the leading cause of urban insomnia. His prescription? A clockless chamber, thick velvet curtains, and a warm brick at the foot of the bed. Some went further. Anti-time pamphlets circulated, with catchy titles like Sleep Should Be Timeless, and The Tyranny of Ticking. You would have laughed if you weren't already contemplating hurling your clock into the fireplace. In wealthier homes, clocks were hidden inside padded cases at night or muffled with cloth. In more modest households, People simply turned them to face the wall, or, in some cases, smashed them altogether. It wasn't just protest. It was desperation. Historians still argue whether the alarm clock's entrance into domestic life did more harm than good. While some point to increased punctuality and industrial discipline, others say it seeded the first waves of modern sleep anxiety. You can decide for yourself tonight, staring into the dark, listening to that phantom tick still echoing even after you've hidden the actual clock in a drawer. But the rebellion didn't stop there. Some inventors, bless them, tried to fight fire with fire. Enter the silent clocks. These devices displayed the time visually, some with sand, others with light and shadow, without a single tick. One memorable design involved a series of colored liquids rising in tubes. It looked more like alchemy than timekeeping. Still, the real revolution was in mindset. The anti-clock movement wasn't just about silence. It was about control. If the clock controlled your day, maybe your night should belong to you. Some reformers argued that the whole notion of fixed bedtime was a mistake. Go to bed when your body begs it, one essay read, and rise when your eyes no longer close. This was radical. It flew in the face of Victorian schedules, factory bells, and railway charts. But for the sleepless, it offered hope. You begin to wonder, what if sleep isn't a command, but an invitation? What if the very act of measuring it is what scares it off? One fringe society took this to the extreme. The nocturnists met at twilight to discuss sleep without clocks. They held candlelit salons where members wore blue robes and shared dreams in hushed tones. Their motto, "The night has no hours." Poetic, if a little culty. Still, there's something liberating about it. Tonight, you resist the urge to check the clock. You don't ask how long you've been lying there. You just breathe. One breath. Another. You let the moment be endless. But old habits die hard. Your hand twitches toward the nightstand. Just a peek, you think. Just to see. You stop yourself. Instead, you imagine a world with no clocks at all. Just sunrise and birdsong and your body's own rhythms, not the angry chime of gears and bells. For the first time in weeks, your heart slows a little. You sink deeper into the mattress, and for a fleeting second, barely noticeable, you forget what time it is. And that might be the most restful thought you've had all night. It's a week later, and your mantle is conspicuously bare. No more brass-faced tormentor. The ticking is gone, but your sleep? Still dodging you like a cat avoiding a bath. So, you take the next logical step, burn the idea of waking up altogether. If clocks are the enemy, then alarm clocks? Absolute traitors. Across Britain, a quiet rebellion brews. Households are tossing alarm clocks into coal bins, burying them in gardens, even gifting them to in-laws as not-so-subtle revenge. Because what good is a device that blares you into consciousness when you've barely managed to nod off? You're not alone. By the 1870s, entire columns and home guides are warning against alarm clocks in bedrooms. They're described as shock machines and morning terrors. One best-selling etiquette manual even advises placing your alarm in the scullery to temper its shriek by distance. The anti-alarm clock movement isn't organized. There's no marching band or official manifesto, but it's everywhere. People quietly whisper their hatred for those cruel spring-loaded bells over tea. Some begin to see them as symbols of everything wrong with the modern world: overwork, rushed breakfasts, the unforgivable sound of gears snapping into place before dawn. Historians still argue whether this backlash was truly widespread or just a cluster of upper-class dramatics. But the evidence, letters, pamphlets, ads for peaceful waking alternatives, suggests something deeper. A cultural fatigue. A yearning for silence, softness, maybe even a return to the pre-industrial natural waking of the farmhand and the shepherd. And so, like a bored inventor with a grudge against punctuality, people begin devising anti-alarm clocks, devices not to wake you up, but to keep you asleep. You read about one in a curious article, a small wooden box with a dial that slows time. It doesn't really, of course, but the inventor insists that watching the hand move slowly tricks the brain into deeper relaxation. Another device emits gentle lavender vapor at hourly intervals throughout the night. Yet another, perhaps more hopeful than functional, releases a tiny music box tune only if you stir in your sleep, aiming to lull you back before your eyes even open. But the crown jewel of these inventions is a marvel called the somnosphere. It's a round, domed contraption that sits above the headboard and produces soft wind sounds using rotating silk ribbons and bellows. The design is exquisite. Useless, probably. but beautifully useless, which, in Victorian terms, makes it perfect for the upper classes. Of course, the working class can't afford such luxury. They improvise. Some hang wool blankets over door frames to absorb noise. Others train family members to gently nudge them if they stir, then immediately whisper a comforting phrase. There's even a story of a Welsh miner's wife who rigged a series of teacups to clank in rhythm with her husband's breathing, a homemade system to keep him from waking too soon. Probably more myth than fact, but charming, no? And then there's you. You decide to create your own anti-alarm. It involves a tin of chamomile leaves, a spoonful of crushed seashells, don't ask, and a ribbon from your childhood bonnet. You tie them together, place the bundle under your pillow, and whisper, "Not tonight, anxiety." It doesn't work, but it makes you feel clever. Like you're not just suffering, but resisting. That's what the anti-alarm ethos is about, really. Not solving insomnia, but flipping it off with velvet-gloved defiance. You're not broken. The world is just loud and rude and insists on ringing bells at 6 a.m. for no good reason. This movement even finds allies among reformers. Some health advocates publish papers declaring alarms a neurological assault. One proposes a gentler solution: train songbirds released at sunrise to sing you awake. Beautiful, until you imagine birds pooping on the bedding. Others go full fringe. One man invents a dream watcher, a device that detects REM by measuring cheek vibrations. His ultimate goal? A machine that knows exactly when to wake you, never too early, never too deep. The device never quite catches on, mostly because it looks like a lobster clamped to your face. But the idea lingers. A better kind of waking. One that doesn't yank you from the depths like a fishhook. And until that happens, the anti-alarmists keep resisting. You even begin to romanticize sleep again. Not as a medical issue or a daily performance, but as something sacred, private, worth protecting. You light a candle before bed now, not for illumination, but as a symbol. A soft rebellion against the hard tick of modern life. Tonight, as you lie down, you notice something. Your breathing matches the candle's flicker. In. Out. Soft light. Soft lungs. There's no alarm to dread. No tick to race. Just you, the hush, and the slow exhale of everything you didn't fix today. You won't wake at a prescribed time tomorrow. You might not even know what time it is. And that, weirdly, feels like peace. The age of alarm clocks will rage on for others. For now, you're reclaiming your night. You wake up, gently, deliciously, with no memory of when you drifted off. There's no mechanical shriek, no stern clock face demanding productivity. Just daylight creeping in like a polite guest and the faint scent of lavender clinging to your pillow. For the first time in ages, you feel rested. A little disoriented, yes, but in that good, dreamy way, like your soul took the long way back. What helped? You can't say for sure. Was it the candle? The absence of the alarm? Or maybe, just maybe, it was your little invention, the anti-alarm bundle. Even if it didn't work scientifically, it felt like it mattered. And that, in Victorian logic, often counted for more than facts. This was the golden age of sleep contraptions. No invention too odd, no patent too absurd. And while alarm clocks were being cast into stables and forgotten cupboards, their opposite, the devices meant to keep you asleep, entered their bizarre, glorious heyday. First came the mechanical dream aids. You read about them in the back pages of magazines or hear about them from your cousin who knows a man who sells things out of a carriage. One of the earliest was the slumber wheel, a curious rotating headrest powered by a slow-turning water weight. It's meant to sway the sleeper gently back and forth, simulating the soothing motion of a cradle. Unfortunately, it also caused minor concussions if wound too tightly. Next was the nocturne arm, this hinged metal appendage extended from the bed frame, lightly pressing on your chest with a padded paw. The idea? Physical reassurance, like a parent gently holding you down, but Victorian style and deeply unsettling. It was discontinued after several cases of the thing misfiring and punching sleepers mid-dream. Historians still argue whether any of these sleep machines genuinely helped or were just elaborate placebos encased in mahogany. But the faith people placed in them was real. And sometimes, in matters of sleep, belief was half the battle. More passive contraptions began circulating too. Like feather funnels, which directed air from your window into a cone of goosedown tubing aimed at your face. Or the Somnambox, a padded, soundproof enclosure that fit over your head like a cozy, upholstered helmet. Advertised as complete dream immersion, it more often resulted in mild suffocation and panic flailing. But not all Victorian sleep tech was absurd. Some of it was quietly ingenious. Take the night mantle, a heated woolen wrap you'd wear to bed, lined with warm bricks and infused with a vinegar blend said to dispel restless humors. Or the ever-popular sleep hammock for urban flats, suspended in a frame to mimic ocean waves. It offered motion without the threat of head trauma. And then there were the beds themselves. You might think you've got it rough with your hand-me-down coil mattress, but Victorians took sleep architecture to a dramatic level. There were 4 poster fortresses designed to block out not just light and sound, but airflow. Curtains lined with lead, for silence, mattresses layered with horsehair and moss, for firmness, and canopies treated with herbs like mugwort and vervain, for dreams. Of course, some beds went a step further. The aristocracy dabbled in insomnia cages, luxurious frameworks built over beds with adjustable iron bars. Not for restraint, but for posture correction. The idea was to force the sleeper into a position deemed ideal by whatever crank doctor was trending that week. Sleeping on your back? Good. On your side? Degenerate. On your stomach? Practically criminal. You try adjusting your sleep position tonight, just to see. Back straight, hands folded gently over your chest like a vampire in repose. It's comfortable for 10 minutes before your shoulder cramps and you remember that rich Victorians also had footmen to massage them at 3 a.m. when their deltoids gave up. Still, the obsession with ideal sleep posture runs deep. Diagrams circulated in penny weeklies showed silhouettes of proper bedtime alignment. One even claimed that those who fell asleep with their toes pointing south were more likely to remember their dreams and less likely to be visited by night spirits. Hard to argue with such rock-solid science. And yet, not everyone had access to such sleep luxuries. For the poor, dreams had to wait. Many laborers slept in shifts, sharing beds with co-workers or even strangers in what was known as hot bedding, one person out, the next one in, still warm. A system so tragically efficient, it would make today's Airbnb seem positively generous. Children often slept in drawers, not because it was adorable, though it is a little adorable, but because there wasn't room. And for many, sleep was accompanied by the sounds of neighbors arguing, roosters crowing prematurely, and factory bells reminding you that rest was a borrowed indulgence. That's what made these anti-alarm devices so precious to those who could afford them. They were not just tools, they were symbols. Of peace, of resistance, of the rare privilege to tell time, not tonight, thank you. And tonight, as you slip back into bed, you drape your blanket just so, adjust your pillow to the correct Victorian-approved angle, and remind yourself that you are not under arrest by the clock. There is no mechanical bell to jerk you from slumber. No chime that must be obeyed. Just the night, the hush, and a padded, possibly haunted, dream helmet you're almost brave enough to try. It's after midnight, and you're still awake. Again. You've tried every potion in your little wooden drawer, read every line of Tennyson's In Memoriam, even rearranged your pillows in a Fibonacci spiral for better dream alignment, a tip from the Household Almanac for refined sleep. Nothing. So tonight, you get inventive. You climb into bed, not just to rest, but to engage in an experiment. You're testing sleep tech, Victorian edition. And no, not the ticking horrors or opium syrup roulette. We're talking body manipulation devices. Beds that poke you, swaddle you, even vibrate ever so slightly, each contraption more determined than the last to knock your brain out cold. You start with the mattress. Gone is the sagging horsehair you've cursed for weeks. In its place is a carefully layered construction, straw for breathability, cork for resilience, and, for reasons no one has explained, a thin layer of crushed seashells meant to absorb nocturnal agitation. Victorian sleep science was heavy on theory, light on comfort. Next up, the pressure cage. It looks like a giant birdcage laid flat over your bed. Designed to calm the nervous system through gentle restraint, it rests just above your blanket, close enough to press down slightly if you fidget too much. Sort of a sleepy time security system. Some doctors swore by it. Others noted it caused dreams involving entrapment, drowning, or being slowly crushed by a very polite ghost. You settle beneath it anyway. The weight is oddly soothing at first, like a firm hug. Until you sneeze and the frame rattles just enough to make you think it might not be entirely bolted down. Victorian sleep engineering didn't stop at pressure. There was the dream pendulum, a weighted velvet pouch hung from the ceiling, set to sway gently over the forehead to stir the pineal ether. Pineal ether being a completely fictional fluid Victorians were obsessed with because it sounded mystic. You tried one once. It worked beautifully until your cat leapt at it and knocked out a tooth. Then there's the somnambulist's cradle. Not a cradle for babies, a cradle for grown-ups with too much imagination and not enough REM. It suspends the mattress between four posts using iron springs, designed to simulate the motion of a sailing ship. Some found it deeply calming. Others discovered that swinging beds don't mix well with late-night mutton stew. Historians still argue whether these elaborate sleep aids were therapeutic or just wealthy Victorians cosplaying as science experiments. One theory suggests the era's obsession with physical sleep regulation came from deeper fears, control, morality, the terrifying thought that you might fail at sleeping without assistance. Which brings us to the infamous postural corrective brace. Imagine a metal corset, except it's for lying down. Straps around your legs, loops for your arms, a headrest that keeps your jaw at the ideal snore angle. You could rent one for a week to retrain the spine and spirit. You didn't make it past night 2. Your back hurt for a fortnight, and you swore the brace whispered Latin in your ear. Still, people swore by these devices. Entire columns in domestic magazines were devoted to tweaking and modifying sleep machines. Want to fall asleep faster? Add lavender sachets to the elbow rests. Trouble staying asleep? Wrap the legs in warm eelskin. Yes, real eelskin. Because it was believed to convey the sea's unconscious pulse. You couldn't make this stuff up. Except you absolutely could, and Victorians did. Often. But not all was absurd. One lesser-known innovation actually made sense: the shoulder shelf. A small ledge built into the headboard, angled perfectly to support the upper arm and prevent tossing. It turns out, gasp, keeping your arms supported can reduce shoulder strain and help you stay still longer. One of the few Victorian ideas you've actually kept. It creaks like a dying violin, but you'll take your wins where you can. Of course, the most extravagant setup belonged to a baronet's wife known only in newspapers as Lady S. Her bed frame contained a hidden gear mechanism that gently tilted her upright in the morning with birdsong from a tiny inlaid pipe organ. She reportedly never opened her eyes before being seated at a perfect breakfasting angle, silk eye mask still on, waiting for her footman to announce the temperature. And then there were the smells. Oh, the smells. Pillow mists made of orris root and lemon verbena. Bedposts rubbed with rosemary and wax. Some even doused their mattress in night balsam, a mix of turpentine, pine resin, and honey meant to induce foresty dreams. If it sounds like you'd be waking up stuck to the sheets, that's because you did. Still, your favorites weren't the fancy rigs or sleep cages. It was the small things. The warm brick at the foot of the bed. The soft ticking of the sleep metronome, not a clock, mind you, just a pendulum moving at a lulling pace, like a lullaby with no lyrics. There's something magical about that kind of deliberate simplicity. And as the candle burns lower tonight, you're starting to realize something. Victorian sleep tech wasn't about luxury. It was about longing. These bizarre beds, vibrating arms, and velvet pendulums were desperate love letters to a state of peace they couldn't quite reach. You understand that now. As your breath evens out and your pressure cage settles into its rhythm, you get it. They weren't trying to control sleep. They were trying to deserve it. You wake to bells, not shrill, factory bells, but something softer. A series of hollow chimes, like spoons on porcelain. They're not real, of course. Just your memory replaying last night's experiment, the spiritualist's midnight bell ritual. It started when you stumbled across a curious leaflet tucked into a second-hand book. The Monk's Method, Sacred Sound and Slumber, a pamphlet promising the secrets of uninterrupted sleep as practiced by cloistered religious orders and sensitives of the finer planes. Naturally, you couldn't resist. So you tried it. You lit a candle at midnight. Knelt, awkwardly, beside your bed. Whispered an incantation so old and odd it made your cat leave the room. Then, at prescribed intervals, you rang a tiny brass bell. Not to wake yourself, but to harmonize the astral threads between this world and the world of dreams. You're not sure what that means. But it sounded like something a Victorian monk-turned-mystic might say. Believe it or not, it helped. A little. Maybe it was the rhythm, maybe the ritual, or maybe the simple act of doing something that felt sacred, instead of just flopping into bed like a guilty noodle. Because while the rest of the world was dosing itself with arsenic and strapping into sleep braces, a different kind of sleep cult was quietly blooming, the spiritualists. These weren't your average seance types. Well, okay, many of them were also seance types, but they had a particular obsession with sleep, not just as rest, but as passage to another world, to the divine, to the self. Monks, mystics, and middle-class clairvoyants began exploring ways to commune with the dreamscape. And at the heart of many of their methods, time. Not clocks, not alarms, but sacred time. Chimes rung on the hour, prayers spoken at the tides of the night, specific sleep schedules drawn from astrological tables and moon phases. If it all sounds like your friend who won't hang out during Mercury retrograde, it is, but with more candles and less kombucha. The idea was simple: align your body to a divine rhythm, and sleep would follow. The monasteries had done this for centuries. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed multiple prayer sessions throughout the night, matins, lauds, vigils, all intended to break sleep into holy fragments. It wasn't restful in the modern sense, but it was purposeful, structured. Like divine interval training, Victorian spiritualists took that structure and laced it with mysticism. Some practiced lucid communion, waking themselves at 3:33 a.m., the supposed hour of highest spiritual activity, to record dream messages or receive guidance. Others followed the triple breath method: inhale slowly 3 times while reciting a verse, then fall asleep while visualizing a golden staircase descending into the earth. You try it. You feel ridiculous. You fall asleep halfway through the second breath. Maybe that means it worked? Historians still argue whether these rituals were early psychology in disguise or just charming nonsense. But they gave people something vital: agency. A sense that sleeplessness wasn't a curse, but a calling. Even the Quakers got involved. They believed that if the body resisted sleep, it must be because the soul had work to do. So they waited, listened. Some kept wake journals, chronicling insights that came in the silent hours. Admittedly, many entries were just lists of things to do the next day and the occasional complaint about stiff bedpans. But others were surprisingly poetic. One line from 1874 reads, "Woke with the image of a white horse descending a spiral staircase." Unsure if divine or simply oats again. In London, a group called the Dream Society formed, equal parts mystic salon and support group for insomniacs. Members met weekly, swapped remedies, discussed their nighttime visions, and sometimes just sat quietly in a room full of lavender, not speaking at all. Their motto: no light, no sound, no shame. You wish they were still around. The spiritual approach to insomnia wasn't about conquering the night. It was about befriending it, seeing wakefulness not as failure, but as a message. A moment. A mystery. Which, let's be honest, is much more romantic than shaking your alarm clock and muttering about how you'll never drink coffee after 4 again. Of course, not everyone was sold. The medical establishment rolled its eyes. A few prominent doctors labeled the bell ritual sleep charlatanry, and one even published a rebuttal titled "On the Uselessness of Spiritual Bells for the Purpose of Nocturnal Repose." Clearly a man invited to very few parties. But for some, the spiritual path offered real comfort. And in a time when women were often excluded from scientific authority, these nighttime rituals gave them a voice. Literally. Women dominated spiritualist circles. They led the ceremonies. They shared dream visions. They taught each other how to calm the nervous system with simple, repetitive prayers whispered just as the body drifted. You wonder what that must have felt like, to enter the night not as a battlefield, but as a sanctuary. Not a place to prove your worth by sleeping properly, but a place to rest because rest was sacred. Tonight, you ring your little bell again. Just once. Soft and quick. Not because you believe it changes the universe, but because it reminds you the night is yours. And for now, that's enough. The numbers are everywhere. On pamphlets, in prayer books, scrawled in the margins of sleep journals. 8, 4, 90, 120. You didn't notice it at first, but now that you're looking, Victorian Insomnia advice is dripping with arithmetic. Sleep, they began to believe, could be solved not with rest, but with math. Welcome to the numerical revolution of Victorian slumber, the era of sleep by numbers. You, my poor nocturnal friend, are about to dip your toes into a world where arithmetic dreams of curing your exhausted body. It begins with the golden ratio of repose, a theory published by an ambitious clergyman turned sleep hygienist named Reverend Aubrey Hollings. He argued that optimal human sleep occurred in repeating cycles of 90 minutes, patterned off biblical numerology and loosely, the life cycle of frogs. According to him, you must never interrupt one of these cycles. Doing so would fracture the soul's nightly restoration and invite melancholy vapors. So, you try it. You plan your bedtime with military precision. If you sleep at 11 p.m., you must wake at 5:30 a.m., not a minute earlier or later. You do the math. You set your anti-alarm candle to burn out right on schedule. And then you lie there, wide awake, calculating the number of frogs you've never met. Because here's the thing, numbers feel reassuring. When everything is out of control, your thoughts, your stomach, your mattress full of straw and resentment, numbers give you a kind of safety. If you can just get the formula right, maybe the sleep will come. Others felt the same. One professor named Balthazar Fynch claimed that all human sleep could be mapped using prime numbers. He kept a chalkboard beside his bed and scratched tallies in the dark, convinced that dream entry points aligned with numeric intervals. His neighbors complained of mysterious late-night tapping, which turned out to be him calculating in Morse code to wake the inner pattern. Victorians loved these kinds of theories. They craved structure, rules, neatness. So they turned to what they trusted, science. Or, at least, what looked like science. Sleep became a thing to chart, graph, and regiment. A particularly popular book titled The Restful Mind, Quantified Slumber for the Professional Gentleman offered dozens of mathematical diagrams, sleep arcs, yawn pyramids, REM spindles, which weren't even a thing yet. It had tables listing how many minutes of sleep were earned for various tasks, 12 minutes for labor, 8 minutes for prayer, 3 minutes for light gossip. You could practically apply for sleep like a tax deduction. Historians still argue whether these numeric theories helped anyone or just made everything worse. Some think the ritual of calculation soothed people into slumber. Others believe it introduced the earliest known form of sleep performance anxiety, with people lying in bed terrified they'd sleep wrong. One widow in Kent wrote in her diary that she no longer trusted her own exhaustion. "I am not sure," she wrote, "whether I am sleepy or merely mistaken." A line that resonates a little too hard in the age of wearable sleep trackers. But it wasn't all absurd. Some theories held surprising truth. The idea of sleep cycles, roughly 90 minutes, has actual biological basis. The trouble was, Victorians didn't know why. So they filled the gaps with mysticism, theology, and more than a few errors in long division. A particularly eccentric, and mildly beloved, schoolteacher named Miss Thistleby swore that reciting multiplication tables backward from 144 would induce a trance state. Her bedtime mantra, 12 12s are 144, 12 11s are 132. You try it. You make it to 12 7s before your brain screams and your pillow gives up. There were more tactile options, too. Somniform counters were sold in some apothecaries, little wooden beads on strings, meant to be clicked quietly under your blanket like a rosary for sleep nerds. One string had 120 beads, 90 for baseline sleep, 30 for dream entry. Click too quickly and you'd have to start over. One French group, the arithmotheurgists, took it further. They claimed specific numbers carried energies. That sleeping for 144 minutes, exactly, opened the body to divine frequencies. They met in candlelit circles and chanted numbers in Fibonacci sequence. Honestly, if it weren't for the sleep deprivation, you'd consider joining. But perhaps the most relatable of all was the common person's tactic, counting sheep. Yes, it did exist in the Victorian era. But with a twist. You didn't just count them, you imagined them jumping over different architectural features. A low hedge? That was a dream preparation sheep. A fence with ivy? That meant a deeper sleep would follow. A wrought iron gate? Bad sign. Start over. Tonight, you give in. You count sheep. You imagine each one with a little Victorian top hat and monocle. You call them things like Sir Bleatsalot and Lady Lambottom. It doesn't help, but it makes you laugh into the pillow, which, honestly, is halfway to rest. Because the truth is, all these numbers and formulas were never really about logic. They were about hope. A way to feel in control when your body betrayed you. A way to turn the most vulnerable act, surrendering to sleep, into something you could win. And even if it didn't always work, it gave the sleepless something to hold onto in the dark. You're walking down a corridor. The gaslights flicker. Your slippers whisper against cold tile. Ahead, a heavy oak door creaks open. Inside? A bed, a chair, and something humming, not a tune, not quite. Electricity. You've arrived at one of Victorian Britain's more unsettling sleep solutions, the insomnia clinic. Not hospitals exactly. These were private rest institutions, places where people with chronic sleeplessness, and the money to pay for it, came to be observed, shocked, hypnotized, and in some cases, politely haunted. The rise of sleep clinics in the late 19th century marked a turning point. No longer was insomnia just a moral or domestic concern. It had become medicalized, institutionalized, monetized. You, unlucky soul, are now a patient in the great experiment of Victorian sleep science. Let's start with the hardware. The moment you're checked in, after signing a waiver, obviously, you're assigned a treatment plan that may involve electrotherapy. It sounds modern, futuristic even, until you realize it involves being wired to a hand-cranked dynamo and lightly zapped in the temples to stimulate the circadian organs, the doctor says. You nod. You have no idea what a circadian organ is. These devices, called sleep inducers in the brochure, delivered mild to moderate jolts of current. Some patients claimed they could feel their thoughts flatten. Others reported heart palpitations and the desire to hit the attending nurse with a nightstand. Your first session leaves your hair puffed and your dreams briefly starring Thomas Edison on a unicycle. But it wasn't just about electricity. There were hypnosis sessions. You'd lie in a recline chair as the doctor, a bearded man with unsettlingly long fingernails, slowly recited phrases like drift, sink, slumber, while waving a silver pendant. You felt ridiculous. You also woke up 2 hours later convinced your name was Margaret. Hypnosis was big in Victorian Britain. Influenced by Mesmer and his controversial ideas about animal magnetism, doctors tried everything from spoken suggestion to colored lanterns projected on the ceiling. One infamous clinic used a rotating disc painted with spirals and cherubs. It was supposed to unlock the dream centers of the brain. It mostly gave people vertigo. Historians still argue whether these hypnosis sessions were genuine therapy or glorified party tricks. Some patients swore by them. Others left more anxious than when they arrived, now fully convinced they'd been implanted with invisible leeches. They hadn't, we think. And then there were the ghost cures. You see, some clinics leaned into the spiritualist craze of the time, especially in the more eccentric countryside retreats, where science met seance. One particularly infamous establishment, the White Heather Rest House, advertised ethereal soothing as part of its sleep protocol. This involved sitting in a dim room while sleep guides, unpaid young women who may or may not have been actors, pretended to channel spirits of the restful dead. They spoke in whispers, rest comes, when worry floats away. Or Queen Mab visits only the brave of heart. Honestly, it was kind of charming, if you ignored the organ music played backward in the background. You tried it once. The ghost said your inner moon was off cycle. She then handed you a glass of warm milk infused with dream crystal powder. You drank it. It was mostly chalk and nutmeg. You did, however, sleep for 4 hours straight afterward. Coincidence? You choose to believe in magic. Some clinics offered isolation sleep. You'd be placed in a perfectly dark, soundproof room with no stimuli. Meals were slid in silently. You were encouraged to do nothing but lie there and allow your nervous system to reset. The problem? Doing absolutely nothing is a surprisingly efficient way to spiral into existential dread. One patient reportedly tried to dig an escape tunnel using a shoehorn. Other methods were equally questionable. Bedrock therapy involved placing the sleeper on a slab of cool stone to ground excess emotional energy. Aromatic descent pumped scents, lavender, patchouli, and something disturbingly like onion, into the room to weigh the soul down into slumber. One fringe clinic even experimented with sleep masks painted with open eyes, so the body would fool itself into resting while remaining alert. This method failed spectacularly when a patient tried to walk home during a dream, still wearing the mask. Of course, none of this came cheap. Clinics catered to the middle and upper classes, where sleeplessness was treated with a kind of tragic nobility. The poor, meanwhile, were advised to simmer herbs and pray for dull weather. One London paper suggested the working class didn't suffer from real insomnia, just bad attitudes. You knew better. The rich might have had gold leaf ceiling mobiles and personal hypnotists, but the dread of night? That was universal. Still, you have to admit, some of the clinics weren't all bad. They offered calm, soft fabrics, rooms with no clocks, no bustle, no expectations. Just a belief, even if misguided, that your body could rest, given the right care. And maybe that belief was half the cure. Tonight, as you settle into your bed back home, you think of those clinics. The odd rituals. The chimes. The scent of rosewater and fear. You skip the electricity and the spectral therapy, but you whisper to yourself, rest comes when worry floats away. You smile. You do not electrocute your temples. Progress. You're back in your own bed, and this time, the problem isn't ghosts or electricity or even ticking. It's you. Or more precisely, it's what society thinks you are, a Victorian woman with nerves as delicate as a lace doily, and a womb that, according to every doctor with a mustache, is responsible for your inability to sleep. Because yes, welcome to the fraught world of hysterical sleep. Where if you're a woman and you can't sleep, it's probably because your uterus is too ambitious. Jealous of your brain? Practicing dark magic? The diagnosis of hysteria was practically a rite of passage. Any middle or upper-class woman who suffered from insomnia, irritability, anxiety, or excessive enthusiasm for literature could expect to hear those four familiar words. It's your nerves, dear. And if you complained too often, you were shipped off to rest. But rest wasn't restful. It was the Weir Mitchell Rest Cure, a program that made you lie still in bed for weeks, sometimes months, without reading, writing, or speaking. Your meals were brought to you. Your thoughts were not consulted. Your protests were chalked up to the same disease they were supposedly curing. Historians still argue whether the rest cure helped or harmed. Some modern scholars say it offered peace in a loud, overstimulating world. Others note it reduced many women to bedridden shadows of themselves, not because they were sick, but because no one listened. You try to imagine it, lying there, hour after hour, day after day, instructed not to think. Your body becoming both prison and evidence. It's no wonder so many women began reporting visions, hallucinations, or terrifying dreams. Their minds had nowhere else to go. Sleep became the only acceptable escape, which is ironic, considering how often women were accused of sleeping wrongly. Doctors published guides warning against female sleep excess, blaming it for everything from infertility to low moral standards. One even argued that dreams about running or flying were signs of uterine ambition. You wish that were a joke. And don't get too comfortable if you're married. Because Victorian medicine had another theory, that insomnia in wives was caused by marital irregularities, a vague phrase covering everything from unspoken resentment to actual trauma. The solution? Frequently, sedatives. Occasionally, conjugal therapy. Rarely, actual empathy. Your bedroom, once a place of peace, becomes a psychological arena. Every sigh, every shift beneath the covers is interpreted. Are you cold? Frustrated? Secretly reading novels by candlelight? One woman wrote in her journal that she pretended to sleep so her husband would stop offering her licorice drops infused with calming powders. She suspected they were mostly chloroform. She was probably right. Meanwhile, women's magazines were filled with advice on maintaining restful femininity. Sleep hygiene tips included brushing your hair exactly 100 times, dabbing rosewater behind each ear, and avoiding stimulating thoughts like political discourse or arithmetic. You're not sure which is more insulting, that they thought women couldn't count, or that sleep could be ruined by remembering how many chairs were in Parliament. But women weren't helpless. Far from it. They built networks, quiet ones. Letters passed between cousins, friends, sisters, with notes like try lavender under the pillow, not valerian, makes your dreams less sharp. They traded calming tea recipes, anti-anxiety knitting patterns, and tips on feigning sleep during unwanted conversations. And some rebelled outright. They wrote. Charlotte Perkins Gilman famously challenged the rest cure in the Yellow Wallpaper, a short story that still crawls under your skin with its depiction of a woman driven to madness not by illness, but by enforced idleness. Others joined spiritualist circles, as you've already seen. Their wakefulness became power. They led dream interpretation salons and moon-watching vigils. Their insomnia wasn't weakness, it was vision. You, tonight, channel a little of that rebellion. You're tired of blaming your nerves. You're tired of whispering your insomnia like it's shameful. You light a candle. You brew a tea you found in a letter from a woman named Aunt Effie. It smells of lemon balm and dried rose hips. And as you sip, you think about all those women lying awake across time. Not broken. Not hysterical. Just thinking, feeling, waiting. There's strength in that. The bed no longer feels like a trap tonight. It's a ship. The tea, your sails. The candle, your lantern. You're navigating night not with fear, but with quiet rebellion. You lie back. You breathe. And for the first time in a while, you don't try to fix your sleep. You just allow it. It's late again, and your windows rattle with wind off the Thames. But your mind isn't on the chill, it's far away, somewhere on a tea plantation in Ceylon, or maybe aboard a steamer slicing through the Suez Canal. You're trying to sleep, yes, but your dreams are crowded. Too loud. Too imperial. This is the strange paradox of Victorian slumber. While the body lay in a warm bed in London, the mind often drifted through the empire's farthest reaches. Because in the 19th century, even sleep wasn't immune to empire. And for many, the act of not sleeping was its own dark reckoning. You, of course, aren't hauling spices or carving railway lines through unfamiliar landscapes. But if you're middle class, you've read the stories. You've bought the sugar. You drink the tea every evening to soothe your nerves, even though part of you knows it may be doing the opposite. Caffeine, meet colonialism. Historians still argue whether Victorian insomnia increased as a side effect of empire building or simply mirrored the anxieties that empire generated. What's clear is this: the more global Britain's reach, the more unsettled its nights. You've heard the phrase white man's burden. It's not just a slogan, it's a mindset. One that crept into bedrooms and dreamscapes like fog through a window latch. Colonial officials stationed abroad reported frequent insomnia. The heat, they wrote. The insects. The unease. But if you read between the lines, you see something else: guilt, alienation, the deep, grinding awareness that they did not belong, and maybe shouldn't be there at all. Back home, the empire was sold as triumph, progress, destiny. But in the small hours, long after the day's moral certainties had dimmed with the gaslight, something more complicated stirred. Dreams turned to fever. Sleep fled from those who needed it most. One particularly haunted case involved a prominent trade commissioner who claimed to dream nightly of the elephants he had hunted in Burma. He eventually stopped sleeping altogether, convinced that the spirits of those animals now stood just outside his door. A tale dismissed at the time as native superstition absorption. But you read it now and hear something different. A reckoning. Even the language of sleep became imperial. You conquered insomnia. You mastered the night. Terms borrowed from expansionist zeal, applied awkwardly to the soft, uncontrollable act of rest. It's not a coincidence. And let's not forget the role of time itself. As trains, telegrams, and steamships compressed the world, so too did sleep expectations shrink. The empire had schedules, clocks, maps carved into time zones. You weren't just expected to sleep, you were expected to do it efficiently, quietly, without fuss. Preferably in 6 hours or fewer, so you could be up in time to review colonial reports before breakfast. For you, back in Britain, even dreaming became a kind of imperial performance. Popular magazines printed stories about exotic dreamlands, often lifted straight from travelers' journals and reimagined as bedtime tales. Palm trees swayed, tigers prowled, women with veils and unreadable eyes offered forbidden fruit to well-meaning explorers. You tried reading one such story once before bed. It featured a British botanist who fell asleep under a mango tree and awoke with an epiphany about universal peace. You had nightmares about mangoes for a week, but for many Victorians, these stories shaped their subconscious. Their beds were cradles for far-flung fantasies, often saturated with colonial myths and soft-focus cruelty. And when the dreams turned dark, which they often did, insomnia followed. Women weren't immune either. In fact, some of the most vivid accounts of empire dreams came from widows and sisters of colonial officers. They wrote about disturbed nights filled with visions of jungles, drums, and fire. Whether these dreams were remnants of overheard tales or signs of deeper psychic unrest, no one knows. But the dreams came, and they lingered. Some even tried to use them. One dream society believed that nighttime visions from the colonies were spiritual messages, warnings from displaced souls. They organized group cleansing sleeps, where participants would lie on the floor surrounded by incense and try to collectively dream the guilt away. Spoiler, it didn't work. Still, the idea persisted, that sleep might be a portal, not just to rest, but to truth. And for some, that truth was uncomfortable. You think of this tonight as you sip your nightly tea, Darjeeling, as it happens. Imported from somewhere too far away to imagine clearly. You consider skipping it. Not because of the caffeine, because of the history. Instead, you set it down. You lie back, and you listen to the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of wind through the chimney. You wonder what your dreams will hold. Will you sail to strange shores? Will you confront the shadows stitched into your lace curtains? Or will you sleep deeply, at last, and let the empire be someone else's problem for the night? Because sometimes, rest is resistance. Not in anger, but in defiance of anxiety, of guilt, of duty. Tonight, you choose not to conquer the night. You choose to release it. And with it, maybe, yourself. The air tonight smells like vinegar and velvet. You're in a borrowed bedroom, your cousin's estate outside bath, and it's unnaturally quiet. You sink into a mattress so deep it nearly swallows your elbows. There are 4 layers of curtains, 2 padded door drapes, and what appears to be a chunk of beeswax jammed into the keyhole. The room is a fortress of silence. This, dear friend, is not overkill. It's snore-proofing. Among the upper crust, insomnia wasn't just a personal inconvenience, it was a threat to the domestic order. If the master of the house couldn't sleep, everyone suffered. Servants walked on tiptoe, carriages rerouted, clocks stopped, roosters rehomed. The rich had declared war on sound, and their bedrooms became battlegrounds of baffling acoustic strategies. You lie back and realize you can't hear a single thing. Not even your own heartbeat. Slightly alarming, yes, but undeniably peaceful. This room has been soundproofed according to the latest Victorian trend, somniferous architecture. The walls are double-lined with wool and horsehair, the floor padded with Turkish rugs, and the bedposts wrapped in silken rope to prevent creaking. Even the curtains have weights sewn into the bottom hem to prevent fluttering. Your cousin explains it casually over supper, how the window panes are triple glazed, how the chimney flue has been fitted with a cork damper to stop nocturnal moaning. He says this without irony, spooning parsnip mash like he hasn't just said something that sounds like ghost erotica. Historians still argue whether these elaborate quieting techniques were truly effective or simply status symbols. Certainly, the working class wasn't lining their tenement walls with merino. But for the upper echelons, sleep was part of the brand. You were expected to rise crisp, fresh, and free of under-eye shadows. Anything less and you risked whispers at the conservatory luncheon. This led to some truly Baroque inventions. The snore cone, for instance, was a collapsible funnel placed over the mouth of a sleeping spouse to redirect sound into a wool-lined jar. The theory was acoustically ambitious. The result? A jar full of muffled resentment. There were also night socks for the floorboards, little woolen booties strapped to chair legs to prevent midnight squeaks. Some aristocrats had their floorboards lifted and reinstalled with beeswax coating. One particularly high-strung baronet reportedly had his entire bedroom raised off the foundation on a layer of cork bricks. To float above the ruckus of the world, he wrote, more likely to avoid the butler's early morning sneezes. And yet, despite the extravagance, these measures weren't just about luxury. They were about desperation. Some of these people hadn't truly slept in years. Others slept fine, but couldn't bear the idea of noise. Anticipatory insomnia, the fear of being woken, was the true plague of polite society. So they sprayed vinegar on the hearthstones to neutralize smoke smells. They wrapped clocks in shawls. One duchess insisted on live violets at the bedside to muffle psychic dissonance. Another hired a footman whose sole duty was to oil the hinges of every door twice a night. You can't help but laugh, quietly, at the thought of a grown man in livery cradling a bottle of hinge oil like it's sacred wine. But you also get it. Tonight, in this borrowed room where silence feels like velvet draped over the world, you feel something shift. Your jaw unclenches. Your shoulders soften. You can't hear the neighbors. You can't even hear yourself worry. You've always thought of sleep as something to fight for. Now, it feels like something you're allowed to enter, just because the noise has been shown politely to the door. Of course, it wasn't always this serene. Earlier in the century, bedrooms were shared, noisy, functional. You slept beside your siblings, your spouse, your coughing uncle. Sound was part of life. But as wealth rose, so did walls. Privacy became a virtue. And silence, its most prized expression. But silence isn't always peaceful. You remember reading about a widow in Brighton who, after her husband's death, had her room sealed entirely against noise. She slept in silence for 6 years. Then, one night, a mouse found its way into the wall. She went mad within a week. The sound of not sleeping had become too loud to bear. So maybe there's a balance. Maybe tonight's silence is healing. But maybe tomorrow, you'll let in a creak or two. A soft cough from the hallway. A bit of wind rattling the panes. Because sometimes, what keeps us awake isn't noise, but the fear of it. Still, you're grateful for this night. This floating bed. This sweet, muffled air. You burrow deeper under the blankets, press your cheek into the cool pillow, and let yourself listen to nothing. The room is dim, the sheets are warm, and your belly is full of toast. Not just any toast, perfectly crisped, slathered with clotted cream, and finished with a sprinkle of nutmeg. A modest indulgence, but one with purpose. Because here, in the Victorian world, what you eat before bed is serious business. Tonight, you're sampling the soothing rituals of a people who believed food and sleep were intimately entwined. And not just in the way a midnight biscuit brings comfort, but in the deeply earnest, occasionally bizarre conviction that certain combinations of foods, beverages, and behaviors could unlock the gates of dreamland like a key in a sleepy lock. It begins with tea, of course. Not your average builder's brew. No, the Victorians had a whole taxonomy of bedtime teas. Chamomile, yes. But also vervain, skullcap, passionflower, marjoram, and mugwort, the last of which came with a warning, may cause excessive dreaming or visions of your ancestors. You try it anyway. Your dreams feature a mildly disappointed grandmother urging you to put socks on. Herbal blends were often prescribed by grannies and apothecaries alike, doled out with reverence in a small cloth sachet. Some were simmered for hours, turning into thick, muddy brews. Others were drunk lukewarm by candlelight, paired with prayers, or, if you were feeling especially Victorian, readings from Psalms or the poetry of Thomas Hood. Then there was toast. Not just a snack, but a sleep aid. Medical guides advised bread crisped until golden warm, sometimes rubbed with garlic or dipped in warm milk. One popular concoction was sleep toast, a slice soaked in boiled lettuce water and then topped with crushed aniseed and cinnamon. You make it. It tastes like sweetened pond, but you admit, it does lull the nerves. Historians still argue whether these pre-sleep meals were effective, or if the placebo effect was doing the heavy lifting. But there's something undeniably cozy about the rituals. The repetition. The familiarity. You're no longer chasing sleep, you're welcoming it with buttered bread. Some guides recommended cheese and apples, believing the contrasting textures confused the digestion just enough to make the brain shut down. Others warned against anything too stimulating, looking at you, ginger, cloves, and celery. Apparently, celery was once considered dangerously exciting. Who knew? Your aunt once told you that boiled oats before bed gave you calmer dreams. You tried it. Your dreams featured you sitting in a large beige bowl while a disembodied hand stirred you with a wooden spoon. Interpret that as you will. Beyond food, there were habits, ritualized steps meant to prime the body. Hair must be brushed exactly 50 times. Slippers placed neatly at the bedside. All reflective surfaces, mirrors, shiny doorknobs, overly polished bed frames, covered with cloth, to prevent them from bouncing back thoughts. Yes, really. The Victorians worried that nighttime thoughts could ricochet. You're especially fond of one lesser-known practice, the spoon ritual. Place a silver spoon beneath your pillow, handle pointed north. Why? To draw lunar serenity into the cranium. You try it. The spoon slides out during the night and stabs you in the ear. But your dream includes a glowing moon dog, so maybe it worked? These rituals weren't just superstition. They were a form of control. In a time when medicine was volatile and psychology a half-built staircase, the comfort of doing something, of participating in your own sleep, held immense power. Even working-class homes had rituals. A warm drink. A quiet hymn. The careful placing of one's shoes by the door to walk into the next day without stumbles. Simple, yes, but intentional. A reminder that sleep didn't just happen, it was prepared for. You think of a factory girl who wrote in her diary that she wrapped her bread crusts in newspaper to absorb the day before sleep. A co-worker who fell asleep to the click of his dog's toenails on the floorboards. A seamstress who swore by humming the same lullaby, no words, just the tune, every night since she was 10. And then, of course, there were the superstitions. Don't eat figs before bed, too erotic. Avoid gooseberries, bad for the liver, which was somehow connected to nightmares. And never, ever, sleep with orange peel under your pillow unless you want to marry within the year. You're not sure if that's a threat or a promise. Even the way one extinguished the candle mattered. Blow it up with a single breath to ensure dream clarity. Snuff it with fingers for bravery. Use a bell jar if you fear the devil might catch the smoke. Honestly, bedtime felt like a quiz with no right answers. Tonight, you stick to the basics. Warm milk with honey. A scrap of lavender under the pillow. Your faithful sleep toes. You chew slowly. The room hums with the soft sound of wind and the last crackle of the fire. Your hands rest on your belly. Your eyelids begin to sag, not from exhaustion, but from fullness, from routine, from comfort. Victorian sleep rituals weren't always logical, but they were deliberate. They gave shape to uncertainty. And in a world where even dreams could be judged, these small acts whispered, "You've done enough today. You've earned rest. You believe it. Just a little." And that, maybe, is the real secret ingredient. The bed creaks gently under your weight, but it isn't your own. Tonight, you're visiting your married sister. The guest room is too drafty, so she's offered to let you sleep beside her, just like when you were children. Only now, there's a decorative pillow barrier and a noticeable tension in the air, like the room itself is holding its breath. This, you realize, is Victorian pillow talk, not the romantic kind, but the polite, emotionally freighted exchanges that occur in low voices between married couples sharing a bed under the exacting scrutiny of 19th century moral code. Because sleep, in a Victorian marriage, was anything but simple. It was a performance. A negotiation. Occasionally, a battleground of heavy quilts and heavier silences. You lie on your side, eyes open, and wonder how anyone managed to relax in a bed where intimacy and etiquette were expected to share the same goosefeather pillow. Marriage guides from the period were blunt. A harmonious bedroom ensures a harmonious union. That meant no snoring, no fidgeting, no loud digestive incidents. One manual even advised, let not the wife curl into her husband's warmth without a moral reason. You snored into the pillow. Try explaining moral curling to your ankles at 3 in the morning. Victorian couples often shared beds, but not always for affection. It was practical, economic, and, ironically, encouraged by doctors who believed body heat could stimulate mutual vitality. That's fine if you both fall asleep simultaneously. Less fine if one of you has insomnia and the other talks in your sleep about unpaid taxes. In some households, separate beds were common, especially among the wealthy, who could afford matching twin four-posters with a decorative writing desk between them. But this, too, was a signal. Too much distance? People whispered. Too much closeness? They whispered louder. So the solution became managed proximity. Beds wide enough to create breathing room, but narrow enough to suggest unity. Think together but apart, with a hint of lace and an air of frosted tension. And in these shared beds, nighttime etiquette reigns supreme. Don't speak after lights out unless spoken to. Don't hog the coverlet. If you do awaken your spouse, apologize quietly and offer to fetch warm milk or the smelling salts. Yes, smelling salts. Many couples kept them at the bedside not for fainting, but for waking. If a partner was restless, anxious, or simply bored, a whiff of ammonia carbonate was said to realign the humors. You tried it once. Your humors fled. For women, sleep was both obligation and reprieve. A well-rested wife was seen as virtuous, maternal, and emotionally steady. A sleepless one? Hysterical, frigid, possibly too literary. Many marital advice texts warned against reading in bed. It inflames the mind, one warned. It displaces conversation. Another noted that a distracted wife invites nocturnal distance. Translation: read too much and your husband might go sleep with the dog. You wonder if husbands were ever warned not to quote the parliamentary proceedings while spooning. Doubtful. The medical world had plenty to say about married sleep. Physicians linked sexual dissatisfaction to insomnia, though they rarely offered solutions beyond vague encouragements like gentle conjugal reassurance or, more disturbingly, a tincture of rose and wine. Some doctors even prescribed synchronized breathing, couples instructed to lie face-to-face and inhale in unison until their pulses matched. You try this with your sister. You both laugh so hard the dog barks. Romantic it is not. Still, the intention was sincere. Victorians believed that shared sleep reflected the state of a marriage. If you tossed and turned, perhaps something deeper was wrong. If you dreamt of storms, was there discord in the home? One article even offered dream interpretation services tailored to marital beds. A dream of water meant emotional flux. Fire meant passion or anger. A recurring image of a locked door? Seek communion, lest distance calcify. You hope no one dreams of eels. And then there were the rules for newlyweds. Entire booklets existed on how to behave in the bedroom, not just under the covers, but around them. One suggested wives hum a modest tune before sleep to soothe the marital atmosphere. Another urged grooms to greet each morning with cheer, even in sleeplessness. Imagine being told to smile after 3 hours of listening to someone breathe like a snoring pug. Still, some couples made it work. You read letters where wives described falling asleep mid-sentence, hands tangled with their husbands. Where the pillow was not a barrier, but a bridge. Where even insomnia became a shared story. He rubbed my back until I drifted, and I wrote him a poem while he slept. You think of those couples as you settle in beside your sister. Not quite the same, obviously, but there's comfort in familiar breathing. A kind of rhythm that's neither romance nor obligation, just belonging. You're not here to impress, or to soothe, or to perform. You're just here. Victorian marriage beds carried expectations like weighted blankets. But at their best, they also offered companionship. A reminder that the night wasn't something to face alone. Tonight, you take that lesson for yourself. You reach for the extra pillow, roll to your side, and listen to another human's breath. It's enough. It's almost sleep. You tiptoe past the nursery door and pause, listening. Nothing. No whimpers, no rustle of linen, no half-sung lullabies echoing from a tired throat. For now, the child sleeps. But you don't move yet. You've learned better. It's the silence before the storm that's the most dangerous. Victorian parents, especially mothers, knew that lesson well. Because children, in the age of stiff collars and lace bonnets, did not sleep on command. No matter how many rules were written for them. Victorian Britain was a world obsessed with discipline and routine, and that obsession extended straight into the crib. Sleep wasn't just a milestone, it was a moral test. A quiet baby was a good baby. A wakeful one? An omen, a sign, or simply a burden. And you, dear caretaker, were responsible for getting that tiny anarchist to submit to slumber. Tonight, you're reflecting on the strange, often troubling history of how the Victorians handled children who wouldn't, or couldn't, sleep. You're peeking into nurseries where lullabies were sung, swings were cranked, and bottles filled with sedatives were quietly hidden behind the linen. Start with the basics, lullabies. The melodies were often beautiful. But the lyrics? Haunting. You grew up on Rockabye Baby, and tonight you hum it softly. But you remember the line about the cradle falling, don't you? Many Victorian lullabies were packed with threats, warnings, and bleak little metaphors. Sleep, child, or else. And people wondered why toddlers had night terrors. In wealthier homes, the nursery was its own domain, a separate chamber tended by nannies and nursemaids, stocked with rattles, teething biscuits, and thick wool blankets that practically tucked themselves in. But even with help, there was an air of desperation. Historians still argue whether Victorian children truly slept less than today's, or whether their cries were simply more stigmatized. Either way, the solutions ranged from the quaint to the downright terrifying. Let's start with swings. Not playground swings, but indoor cradle swings, suspended hammocks or wooden boxes rigged with pulleys. The child would be gently rocked by hand, or foot, or in some inventive cases, by the family dog's leash. The idea was constant, rhythmic motion. And if you stopped, the wailing began. Some nurseries employed sleep chairs, tiny recliners with adjustable angles and straps to keep restless toddlers from tumbling out. It was marketed as early posture support. It looked like baby bondage. And then, of course, came the quieting syrups. You open the small apothecary tin on the shelf. Inside is a dark, sticky residue. Just the smell is enough to tell you what's in it. Opium, laudanum, maybe even alcohol. Marketed under names like Godfrey's Cordial, Mother's Helper, or Soothing Syrup, these tonics were sold by the gallon. Mothers were instructed to give a teaspoon as needed. Some babies were dosed 3 or 4 times a day. It kept them quiet. Still, slack-jawed with sleep. You wish this were exaggeration. But newspapers eventually reported on the growing number of infant deaths linked to overdosing. One particularly scathing article called it a nation poisoning its young for the sake of peace. Still, the bottles kept selling. In lower-income homes, things were more improvised. Grandmothers brewed poppy teas. Mothers rocked children wrapped in damp sheets, believing that the cold would shock them into stillness. In the most heartbreaking cases, exhausted parents left infants by open windows in winter to cool the temper. Some of those children didn't wake up. But not every solution was bleak. There were gentle methods, too. Singing bowls filled with warm water, placed near the crib to release soft steam. Lavender satchels tied to the child's ankle. Prayer whispered into the folds of a baby bonnet before sleep. One French group, the Children's Repose League, advocated for storytelling as sleep medicine. Every member memorized a soothing tale meant to be told at exactly the same pace every night. You read one. It was about a mouse who built a bed out of dandelions and dreamed of cheese moons. Utterly ridiculous. Completely charming. And yet, Victorian society struggled to accept the idea of a child simply not sleeping. It was seen as disobedience. Even infants were expected to conform to timetables. Bed by 7, awake by dawn. No fussing. No waking the household. If they failed, the consequences could range from stern looks to actual sedation. Parents weren't spared either. Mothers were routinely blamed. Your milk is too stimulating, one doctor might say. Your nerves are upsetting the child, another would scold. Advice columns were filled with contradictions. Never pick up a crying child, followed by always offer warmth and presence. One even recommended wrapping babies in wool and avoiding overheating. Good luck with that. You try to imagine it, pacing with a baby who won't sleep, who won't stop, while knowing that your failure will be judged not just by neighbors, but by your own doctor. No wonder so many turned to syrups, prayers, and swings. Not because they wanted to, but because there was nothing else. Tonight, you sit by the cot. You hum a tune, one without threats, without falling trees or broken boughs. Just soft vowels and long notes. The baby stirs once, then drifts again. No syrups. No smoke. Just rhythm. You think of all the mothers and nurses and siblings who sat where you sit now, hoping for rest not just for the child, but for themselves. And when the hush finally comes, you let it hold you, too. The hall is packed. Not with applause or speeches, but with snoring. Dozens of people, men and women alike, lie tucked under white sheets on neatly arranged cots. A crowd watches in curious silence. One man in a bowler hat jots notes into a leather-bound booklet. Another murmurs, "That one's twitching, mark it down." You've arrived at one of the strangest fads of the Victorian era, public sleep fairs. Yes, sleep as performance. It's the 1880s, and the latest craze sweeping across Britain's lecture halls, botanical gardens, and health exhibitions isn't phrenology or electric corsets, it's competitive napping. You heard right. People paid good money to watch strangers try to fall asleep. And not in private booths or demonstration rooms. On stages. Under scrutiny. It sounds absurd. But not to the Victorians. For them, sleep was no longer a private, unspoken act, it had become a public obsession. A symbol of health. Of mastery. Of scientific potential. So why not put it on display? These events went by different names. Slumber trials, nap demonstrations, repose exhibitions. Each promised something spectacular. The world's fastest sleeper, the most restful dreamer, the sleeper with the lowest heart rate. You walk among the cots, amazed by the silence. A sign near the door reads, "Please do not wake the contestants." Dreams in progress. You remember reading about the Great Sleep Show of 1886, held in Birmingham's Temperance Hall. It drew over 400 spectators and featured 24 volunteers who attempted to sleep in timed intervals while their sleep efficiency was rated by a panel of physicians, clergy, and one opera critic. One man was praised for his swan-like surrender. A woman received a certificate for maintaining the same facial expression for 5 hours. A boy was disqualified after kicking off his blanket and whispering about oranges. Historians still argue whether these fairs were legitimate studies or just sensationalist gimmicks. Some saw them as part of a growing movement to understand human rest. Others called them nap circuses, demeaning, exploitative, and oddly intimate. You're inclined to agree with both. Not all participants were volunteers. In some cases, orphans from workhouses were brought in, donated, as one flyer put it, to lie down for science. They were promised clean sheets and a warm meal. You hope they got both. But the adults often came willingly. Some for the cash prize. Some for the novelty. Others genuinely believed their sleep was special. That they could teach it, like a skill. You pass a woman who swears she can fall asleep in 60 seconds flat using a self-taught humming technique. She demonstrates. You're halfway convinced. The sleep fairs also featured products. Oh yes. Booths lined the outer walls of the hall, hawking everything from anti-snore nose rings to dream paste that you smear behind your ears for faster descent into sleep. There were pillow fortifiers, hand-warmed bed socks, herbal sleep lozenges, and something called the yawn frame, a headrest that gently encouraged your jaw to slacken. You try it. It makes you look like a surprised codfish. One doctor lectures on the benefits of goat milk before bed. Another sells sleep charts with astrological overlays. Don't try to nap under a waning moon, he warns. A group of spiritualists offer dream interpretation pamphlets and light crystal massages. You accept a sample and end up with glitter in your eyebrows. Still, beneath the spectacle, there's something poignant. These people weren't just performers or charlatans. Many of them were desperate, truly sleepless. They volunteered for these events hoping someone, anyone, might offer a solution. Or at least understand. One testimonial reads, "I have not slept more than 4 hours in as many years. If I lie down under your gaze and find peace, I will bless your curiosity." It's signed only AW. Some events turned emotional. Spectators wept as volunteers finally drifted off, after years of insomnia. A nurse at one London fair sang lullabies to the contestants. She wasn't part of the show. She just couldn't bear to watch them suffer in silence. And of course, there were the nap contests. Participants were judged not only on how quickly they fell asleep, but how long they stayed under and how peaceful they looked. Bonus points for not snoring. One judge deducted points for excessive drooling. Another awarded a perfect score to a man who snuggled his own elbow with angelic finesse. It was absurd, tender, beautiful, in a way. Tonight, you imagine yourself in one of those cots. The eyes of the crowd fade into the dark. The hush settles like velvet. You breathe deeper, slower, not to impress, but to rest. Because if you take anything from this strange chapter of Victorian history, let it be this: even in the most theatrical, performative moments, people were still just trying to sleep. To be still. To find peace. You roll onto your side and imagine an invisible audience clapping politely as you drift off. You're lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and wondering what it all means. Not the shadows dancing across your wallpaper. Not the damp curl of air under the door. But the not sleeping itself. Why does your body rebel? Why does your mind resist the very thing it craves? Tonight, your insomnia feels psychological. And that, my sleepless friend, brings you to a critical turning point in Victorian sleep history, when science stopped just poking the body and began peering into the mind. When insomnia wasn't just a medical issue or a moral failing but a question of identity, of inner turmoil, of dreams that refuse to stay buried. You're in the late 19th century now, and something new is bubbling in the drawing rooms of London and Vienna. It's called psychology, and the sleepless are flocking to it like moths to a candlelit therapy session. Before Freud made his name, before Jung scribbled symbols in alpine notebooks, Victorian thinkers were already sniffing around the idea that sleep troubles had emotional roots. The idea was radical. What if you weren't broken because your body couldn't rest, but because your mind was busy telling secrets? One of the earliest trailblazers was a Scottish physician named James Braid. He dabbled in mesmerism, read, proto-hypnosis, not to entrance people for fun, but to investigate why sleep seemed to elude some and overwhelm others. He believed that the excessively conscious mind could override the body's natural sleep rhythms. You feel that tonight. You've been excessively conscious since Tuesday. Soon, others joined the exploration. Psychologists began linking dreams, anxiety, trauma, even guilt to the nightly battle with rest. Repressed thought manifests as sleeplessness, one theorist wrote. Another claimed the inability to sleep was a rebellion of the inner child. A third just drew a frowny face next to the word supper. Historians still argue whether early psychology offered real insights or simply replaced one kind of snake oil with another. But for many, the shift was liberating. At last, insomnia wasn't your fault. It was a symptom. A message. And those messages were often decoded in offices that smelled of leather, ink, and overconfidence. Victorian psychologists loved couches. Not for lounging, but for laying down their subjects and peeling back the layers of the subconscious like overripe plums. You can picture it. You lie down on a tufted velvet chaise. The doctor behind you adjusts his pince-nez and says, Tell me about your dreams. You murmur something about flying goats. He nods thoughtfully and writes, patient shows signs of maternal metaphor fatigue. You're not sure what that means. Neither is he. But it sounds profound. These sessions often explored sleep routines, recurring nightmares, and even what position you favored in bed. One psychologist insisted that people who slept curled up were avoiding something emotionally. Those who starfished, craving attention. Those who slept on their stomachs with their arms under their heads, emotionally overextended, possibly hiding illicit cheese habits. The science was soft, but the compassion? That was new. Sleep clinics began incorporating psychological evaluations. Instead of just measuring your breath or shocking your spine, they asked questions. How do you feel about your mother? When was your last moment of peace? What does your body fear in the dark? For women especially, this shift was monumental. No longer automatically labeled hysterical, some were now seen as introspective, insightful, perhaps even intellectually restless. One woman's refusal to sleep became the basis for a series of lectures on female cognitive overflow. Did the lecturers still insist she had an overactive womb? Yes, but baby steps. There were fringe thinkers, too. A group called the Nocturnauts believed that insomnia was not a disorder, but a gift, a doorway to the hidden self. They held midnight therapy salons where members shared dreams, confessed fears, and sometimes lay in complete silence together for hours, listening to each other not sleep. Honestly, that sounds kind of nice. Tonight, you try a little amateur therapy of your own. You lie down and whisper questions into the dark. What's keeping me awake? What am I afraid of forgetting? What am I not ready to let go? You don't get answers, but your breath slows. You imagine your thoughts like unruly dinner guests. Some want attention. Some want dessert. Some are just here to break plates. You smile at them. You nod. You tell them, gently, not now. And, to your surprise, they begin to quiet. Maybe that's what the early psychologists were getting at. Sleep doesn't come when we force it. It comes when we make peace with being awake. Not every Victorian theory aged well. Some insisted that insomnia was caused by moral weakness. Others believed only lower types suffered from nightmares. One doctor tried to cure a patient by making him sleep in a mirror-lined room to confront the true self. The patient reportedly screamed for 6 hours and then fled to France. But still, the effort mattered. They were trying. They were beginning to see what we now know, that rest isn't just physical. It's emotional, psychological, maybe even spiritual. Tonight, you don't fight yourself. You don't count. You don't pray for blackout. You just listen. To your heart. To your thoughts. To the quiet voice saying, it's okay to still be awake. You light the candle a little slower tonight. Its flame is familiar now, less a source of light, more a signal. A quiet invitation to begin the nightly unraveling. You sit at the edge of your bed, blanket folded with ceremonial neatness, pillow plumped just so. And still, somewhere deep in your bones, you know, something has changed. Because the old ways are fading. Victorian Britain, so bound to ritual and superstition, tincture and ticking, is slipping into a new century. And with it, the twilight world of anti-alarm clocks and sleep cages begins to flicker out like so many gas lamps. You can feel it. The pace quickening. The lights growing brighter. The hush of night, once revered, now trespassed by electricity's hum. By the 1920s, insomnia is no longer a curious affliction of nervous poets or overeducated women. It's a common complaint. Newspapers print sleep advice in the margins beside adverts for toothpaste and vacuum cleaners. There's a growing sense that sleeplessness is not mysterious or sacred, it's inefficient. You sigh. Because you've lived through both worlds now, the solemn, fumbling efforts of the Victorians to woo sleep with feathers and bells, and the New World's brusque promise to fix it. Quickly. Mechanically. For profit. The first signs of change came with the death of gaslight. Electric lighting, with its unblinking harshness, extended the workday, shrank the evening, and invited insomnia not as tragedy, but as inconvenience. Can't sleep? Read more. Work more. Take a pill. Take 2. Then came the pharmaceuticals. Gone were the muddled cordials with their secret recipes. Now you had tablets. Packaged. Predictable. You were expected to take them and report your results. No poetry. No dreams. Just dosage and relief. Historians still argue whether this was progress or simply a rebranding of sedation. Certainly, the risks didn't vanish. New chemicals had their own dangers. But the tone had shifted. Sleep was no longer a journey. It was a transaction. Sleep culture followed suit. The rituals, once intimate and strange, were swept aside for sleekness. Bedrooms lost their character. Four-posters were replaced by steel frames. Feathers gave way to factory springs. Nightwear shifted from embroidered flannel to rayon blends. The silence was no longer velvet, it was sterile. You think of the anti-alarm clocks, so lovingly crafted to guard sleep like a knight with a lavender sword. Gone. In their place? The electric alarm clock. Relentless. Unapologetic. Its shrill buzz became the punctuation mark on every failed night. No more silent chimes. No more scent diffusers or wool-wrapped keys. Just buzz, and you're late again. And yet, even amid the chrome and crackle of modernity, some remnants clung on. Elderly relatives still lit candles before bed. Country households still hung sachets of chamomile and thyme above the bedstead. One woman, you recall, refused to install electric lighting in her bedroom until 1952. She claimed the bulbs made her dreams too loud. The fringe practices of the Victorians, once considered eccentric, now began to fade into the shadows of memory. The dream circles, the pendulums, the spoon under the pillow charm, each replaced, ridiculed, or simply forgotten. But not by everyone. In small corners of Britain, and perhaps in hearts like yours, there lingered a curiosity. A hunger for the why of sleep, not just the how fast. You find yourself reading old pamphlets with new eyes. Recreating rituals, not to replicate the past, but to honor it. A candle here. A prayer muttered more out of rhythm than belief. A cup of mugwort tea that tastes like dirt and possibility. You know the world has changed. Sleep is now monetized, tracked, optimized. People wear rings that record their pulse, apps that whisper ocean sounds into their ears. Insomnia is treated with clinical precision, and yet, somehow, it's still here. Still winning. Which makes you wonder, maybe the Victorians knew something we don't. Not in their syrups or cages or dream helmets, but in their attention. Their willingness to court sleep like a fickle muse instead of trying to conquer it. You think of all the things you've tried. Some worked. Most didn't. But all of them, in their strange, candlelit way, taught you something. That rest isn't something you earn by working harder. It's something you invite, with patience, curiosity, and a bit of ritual. Tonight, as you blow out the candle, you hear the faint hum of the electric street lamp outside. But you also hear your breath, your pulse, the settling of the room around you like an old friend pulling up a chair. You've made your peace with sleep's refusal. And somehow, that peace softens its edge. The age of the anti-alarm clock is over. But you carry its quiet rebellion with you. Tonight, you lie on your back and feel it, that familiar ache in your chest, not from pain, but from wanting something so simple it almost feels unreasonable. Rest. Not just sleep. Not just the 8 prescribed hours. But real, bone-deep, soul-quieting rest. You've come a long way since the start of this strange journey. Through laudanum and lavender, whispering bells and vibrating beds, Victorian dream math and ghostly lullabies. And now, here you are, in a room with no clock, no glowing screen, no powdered tonic on the nightstand. Just you and the hum of a fan you bought after reading a blog post about white noise for anxious sleepers. Because yes, that's where we are now. The past has dissolved into the present, and while the brass clocks in some ambulists' cradles may be gone, the obsession? It lingers, thrives, evolves. The Victorians may have feared the night, but we fight it. Insomnia has survived every era, adapted to every technology. Now, we track it with smartwatches, diagnose it with algorithms. We listen to pink noise, green noise, whale sounds, and YouTube videos with 1,000 titles like Deep Sleep in 5 minutes, guaranteed. Spoiler, it usually isn't. You laugh softly into your pillow. A laugh full of recognition. Because no matter how much science advances, sleep still slips through our fingers. And when it does, we still reach for rituals, just like they did. Historians still argue whether the Victorian era's obsession with sleep was a symptom of their guilt, their restlessness, or their yearning for control. But maybe it was something simpler, a deep, human hunger for quiet. A belief that sleep was sacred, not transactional. Not productive. Just necessary. That belief is still with us. Even now, you see it in the apps that guide breathing, the blackout curtains, the gentle alarms that fade in like a sunrise, the sleep coaches who cost more than your rent. Our anti-alarm clocks aren't made of mahogany anymore, but they exist. They're the weighted blanket, the ASMR whisper, the decision to put the phone down just this once. We still fear the night, but we no longer face it with gaslight and arsenic. We face it with playlists, with peppermint tea, with melatonin and hope. And somewhere in that, there's a tiny flicker of what the Victorians wanted so badly: permission to be still, to not be alert, to let the world carry on for a few hours without our participation. Tonight, you close your eyes and feel the echoes of everything you've learned. That clocks can be liars. That rituals can be armor. That sleep isn't earned, it's welcomed. And maybe most importantly, that you are not alone. You never were. You lie in the company of 1,000 sleepless souls, past and present, all whispering the same wordless wish into the dark. Rest. You're still here. Still awake, maybe. Or perhaps floating somewhere between this world and the one behind your eyelids. Either way, it's okay. You've done enough for today. Let the story soften now. Let the edges blur. The room around you is quiet. The candle's gone. The ghosts have retreated. The ticking has stopped. You are no longer in Victorian England, no longer tucked beneath iron canopy beds or listening for chimes at midnight. You're here. In your bed. In your breath. And that's all you need. Let each breath be slower than the last. Let your limbs feel heavier, your thoughts feel further away. Nothing urgent waits for you. No bells will ring. No alarm will startle you out of this moment. You are allowed to rest. Let the memory of strange cures and scented rituals fade into a soft murmur. Let the dream math drift away, the sleep fares dissolve into fog. There are no contests now. No measurements. Just this gentle weightlessness. You don't have to sleep perfectly. You don't have to sleep yet. All you need to do is rest. And if that rest turns into sleep, let it arrive like a guest at the door, unannounced, but welcome. The night is long, but it's yours. So take one more breath. Let the past go. Let the world be quiet, just for now. And sleep, when you're ready. Sweet dreams.